How's it going, everybody? Bryan, Alvarez, and Dave Meltzer here, Wrestling Observer Radio. It is October 3, 2017, figure4online.com/wrestlingobserver.com. Breaking news audio today, the passing of Lance Russell at the age of 91 years old after a fall, a couple of falls actually, but a fall last week that he never recovered from. And
Friday morning.
Yep, Dave, know a lot about Lance Russell. Worked for years. I was just thinking, you talked about it the other day, but the Wrestling Observer hotline where every day he would get up and do the menu options and talk about who was talking about what on each. I mean, it's a little thing in his career, but...
Yeah, he listened to all of our stuff, and then he would do the previews for what we were talking about. And, yeah, I mean, we were, you and I, that's where we first became in contact with each other, was through that hotline. And Lance was the host of the hotline. So, I mean, I worked with him from a business standpoint for several years. And he also did the pay, he ran the business. He did the records for everybody and everything like that, logged how many calls and how many minutes and all the stats, we got the monthly breakdowns and everything. And, but that's a very minor part of his career.
It is a very minor part, but that's literally why we're doing this show right now. That's
why we're doing the show right now.
That's right. Yeah. I sent you a fax because a slot opened up on that same hotline that Lance was running, and I said, "Do you want somebody to do option 2 or whatever?" And you said yes, and the rest is history.
So that's right. Can you imagine he essentially? He was somewhat responsible for you and I getting together. He was completely 100% responsible for Jerry Lawler getting into wrestling.
Yep.
Dave Brown being the most successful media personality in Memphis for decades, and he was 100% responsible for that. And they'll both tell you. I mean, it's not even 90%; it's 100%. I'll go through those stories real quick. I'm sure they'll both tell it. But so Lawler was a kid who was a big wrestling fan, and he was in high school, and he sent art. He was an artist, and he sent artwork to Lance. Just of drawings of the Von Brauners and whoever else, Jackie Fargo, Tojo, Yamamoto, the big stars there. And Lance was so impressed that he called him up on the phone, and Lawler's just a kid in high school, and Lance is was a huge media personality. I mean, unless you are in Memphis or to an extent Nashville, Louisville, those cities, I don't think you can really understand how big Lance Russell was as an announcer. It's like, you say Jim Ross, but it's or Gordon Soley or something, and they were big, but you got to understand, this is a TV show that's doing a 20 rating and a 70 share. Everybody is watching this show. That's a kid, especially. If you were a kid in let's say you were in 5th grade in 1977, just throwing some year in, right? Or 1987 for that matter. Maybe 87 is a little bit past the peak, but certainly through 85 when they were still going strong. Every guy in your class is watching that Memphis wrestling show, or 90% of the guys, girls not so much, but every guy did. And Lance was he was the guy you watched on the show, and he had a credibility with that audience because he was such a nice guy, which he was in real life. So anyway, so Lawler sent him the drawings. Lance calls him up at home, and in the discussion, they decide to incorporate Lawler's drawings on the TV show where Lawler and his father, Lawler and Jerry's father, would go to the matches. And Jerry Lawler would do sketches of, what happened, because they didn't do video of the matches. This is the old Ellis Auditorium. And, he would draw essentially what the finish was. And Lance on the Saturday show would talk about the Monday night matches and go in the Tojo and Jackie Fargo versus the Von Brauners match, Gentleman Saul threw fire, and they'd have Lawler's drawing of Gentleman Saul throwing fire or whatever the finish was, or whoever it was, Dr. Ken Ramey doing this and that. And so Lawler would do these drawings every week, and they would put them on the air. And Lance brought Lawler on the air as a high school kid and goes, "This is the guy who does our artwork." And when Lawler, when he was at the studio, a lot of the wrestlers were real impressed with him. And one of them was Jackie Fargo, who had a sign company. And so Lawler began drawing signs for Jackie Fargo's company. And in tune, Lawler and Jackie Fargo became close, and Fargo became like his mentor. And Lawler became, became a wrestler. He actually became a DJ first, where Fargo was a DJ, and also doing wrestling at the time, DJ on one of the radio stations. And he got Lawler a DJ job. And then Lawler, wanted to become a wrestler. And Lawler actually became a wrestler on independent shows outside of Fargo. Fargo didn't get him in there, but when he got, reasonably decent at it, where the local promotion would use him, Fargo got him in. And then a couple of years later, mid-'70s, the famous Lawler-Fargo angle, which is the most famous angle in the history of Memphis wrestling, where Fargo was the top guy, and Fargo was now aging and knew that it was time to pass the torch. And Lawler had already become a phenomenal drawing card as a heel. And Fargo was the babyface, Lawler was the heel, and everybody knew this program that Fargo was going to beat him at the end. But Lawler beat Fargo at the end, won the, they were doing sellout crowds every night, and of course Lawler from there, and really from a couple of years earlier than that, Lawler made it in Memphis. Was with Jim White as a tag team, but the Lawler-Fargo feud put him over the top, and Lawler was the guy in Memphis, and until the end of Memphis wrestling. And Lance was there the whole time, and people will compare them to Howard Cosell and Muhammad Ali. I always considered Gordon Solie and Dusty more of that. Cosell and Ali, where they were, even though like when Lawler was a heel, they would go back and forth, and Lance would be the baby face. But you could tell they were so, deep down, obviously they loved each other. And then Lawler, of course, became the top baby face, and and Lance with Dave. Dave was. I'm not sure exactly what Dave was doing. This is in the 60s. But Lance was the head of programming at WHBQ. Aside from being the wrestling announcer, his main job was head of programming. And he, one of his proudest moves was wrestling was on in the afternoons, and it would get preempted by, sports a lot on Saturday afternoons. And so Lance was just like, this is kind of like not the best thing for the wrestling show, because it was, so he moved it because I want to get it in time slot where it wouldn't be preempted by sports. So he moved to 11 o'clock Saturday morning. And at the time, everyone was going like, nobody but kids watch television Saturday morning, and wrestling is an adult thing. Well, what ended up happening was, the adults watched it because there was nothing else on in the market at 11 o'clock. And the kids watched it because it was more fun than the cartoons that were on. And, Memphis wrestling on Saturday morning, this show aired from 11 o'clock till 12:30 on Saturday morning. And it did bigger numbers than all but the most successful primetime shows did in the market. It did bigger than everything. There were years where if there was a World Series game that was on, when they moved to NBC, Channel 5, so this would be after 77, that when they would move, that they would preempt the World Series in Memphis because the ratings of Memphis wrestling were so good. And one of the things, there's so many stories, but when in 77, there was a big promotional split, and Lance and Dave Brown were going to come. They had done the show on Channel 13 for Nick Goulas, and then Jarrett, when Goulas had the split, Lawler, Rocky Johnson, most of the top guys went with Jarrett. Tojo and Fargo stayed with Goulas. Fargo, being, still a big star and everything at the time. And Lance and Dave, for contract reasons, because they both worked for Channel 13, Lance was the program director and Dave was the weatherman at the time. They had to wait until their contracts ran out before they could come to Channel 5 and do the wrestling, which was only a couple of weeks. They arranged it to where, they were only going to be off for a couple of weeks. I think Lance maybe 2-3 weeks, Dave maybe 6 weeks, 5 weeks. I don't remember. I don't know the exact numbers. But the first 2 weeks of television, it was not that there was a new wrestling show. It was on a new station. Lawler was on the show. They had a couple of local DJs do the announcing. And the big outcry was not like, where's Fargo, where's Tojo, where's the guys that, were on the show that aren't on the show now. It was, where's Lance and Dave? Where's Lance and Dave? And, when Lance came the first show, it was like, a couple weeks later, it was like a big deal. And him and Lawler went back and forth. They had like a classic interview. Lawler was a heel at the time. And Lawler was, they were just, like Lance, everybody thinks it's, you've been out there doing, fishing and things like this, but everyone knows that you've really been watching wrestling every Saturday morning to see the King. And Lance would do the thing of like, well, the one thing I wasn't looking forward to is coming back and having to hear your mouth, and your mouth hasn't changed in, all the weeks I've been away. But then at the very end of the interview, Lawler just goes, kind of like winks at him and just goes, it's really good to see that big nose of yours again, like that. And, there's just so many, Lance worked for WCW for a couple of years, I think maybe 5 years. I'll have to look up the number of years, because it's all, it's all just happened this morning. I woke up and, the worst way in the world to wake up, even though, I think that people who heard our show with JR and heard the show on Sunday night especially, I think you knew what was up. I didn't want to say more, in case something changed, but, when Saturday, I think it was Sunday morning, I should say, Sunday morning, because he went in, he was hospitalized on Friday. It got bad on Saturday night. And so I remember like Sunday morning, like, I don't even want to talk about myself, but it was really weird. And I told you the story on Sunday night, that then when I woke up that morning, it was like the phone rang at 4 a.m. It's like, I'm not answering this phone. And all of a sudden it hit me that like, I didn't even want to go near the computer. It was almost like I was telling myself that as long as I don't answer the phone, and as long as I don't go near the computer, this isn't going to be, everything will be okay. I mean, that's how bad this was for me. Lance was, really, if I was to say my favorite people in wrestling of that generation, it's Terry Funk, Lance, and Bruno. Just because, and not because of, what their star power was, but because of how nice they all were. And, you guys have heard them, any of them on the show know what I mean by that. They're very, very nice people. They were like, almost like uncles or something like that in many ways. And with, but of the three, Lance I knew more, I've known Terry longer, but Lance I knew more personally in a different way. And, like the guy where, every year on my birthday, he would call up, and just go, it's October 24th, and I know to call Dave Meltzer and Bill Dundee, because Bill Dundee's birthday is the same day. And, just that kind of a guy. And with Dave Brown was a guy who worked at WHBQ that Lance took a liking to, and Lance put him on the Dialing for Dollars movie, which was his first television break. And then he got him his job as a weatherman. And, Dave Brown became the weatherman in Memphis until he retired just a couple of years ago. He was the most popular television news personality in the Memphis market, for, 40 plus, let's see, I don't know when he became most popular, but he was a weatherman from the late 60s until, 2000, just until recently, like the last 2 years maybe. So we're talking about close to 50 years of, a guy in the market being the guy, the number one news guy, and, just like that. And it's just like, and we haven't even talked about the fact that, Lance was the best host of a wrestling show that there ever was and ever will be. Just because of the nature of the show itself will never allow for someone to be like that. It's just it's a different product. You can't have that local, you're never going to have the local wrestling, and you're never going to have wrestling. You're never going to have wrestling in any market as popular as that wrestling was in that market for a million reasons, from the fact that there's more entertainment options and all that, which is, and just, it's just never, it's an era that's never going to happen. It was a wonderful era for those people who lived through it every week, and it's like a whole, that whole area. It's like they Saturday morning, they woke up and had their breakfast and, watched Lance, and Lance was the guy in their home who they trusted. I mean, they would give him some of the most ridiculous angles, and him and Dave Brown would somehow make them credible. The way they reacted, they got the heels over, they got the faces over. You know, they were never uncool. I mean, I think one of the reasons why you have, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I think that fans like really, you know, sometimes will go like on Raw, especially, you know, for the heels, you know, on both shows, is because when the announcers, the heel announcers are kind of like the cool guy in some sense, but the face announcers are completely uncool. Or there's no, like Tom Phillips is like he's just a guy in a suit sitting there. There's no connection whatsoever. You know, he's trained to do something a certain way. Michael Cole is better known, but Michael Cole, which you talked about before, he's, you know, nobody thinks of Michael Cole as a cool guy or like your uncle or anything. He's a guy that's hired to say things that, you know he doesn't believe, and he knows, he doesn't believe, and he's just playing a role. Like with Lance, it was like, even when it was like completely preposterous and deep down you knew that Lance and Jerry Lawler, you know, were really, really close, they made it like that they deep down liked each other. You knew it. You could see the chemistry on the screen. But Lance still was mad at this guy who deep down he liked, who was, you know, pulling dirty tactics and screwing Bill Dundee and whatever it was, you know, during the years, you know, the different things Lawler did when Lawler was a heel. And, yeah, just, you know, and then, when, I remember, you know, meeting him, he was one of the first guys, was so open to me about, you know, theories of wrestling and promoters and dealing with promoters and dealing with people in wrestling and who's cool and who's not cool and everything like that. And, yeah, just, you know, but yeah, the guy was, you know, an institution in this industry. It's just kind of a shame. You know, again, it's been a long time since the prime of Lance Russell's announcer. I mean, he did announce regularly, you know, through whatever, about 96, and then he would come back on the remakes of Memphis wrestling later, when, you know, after the glory days and everything like that. But you know, Lance Russell of the 70s and the 80s, just whatever the circumstance was, whatever the angle was, he always got it over. You know, when you look at those attendance figures that they did week in and week out, and yeah, Lawler was the guy driving the attendance, and, you know, there was many other people like the Fabulous Ones and, you know, different people at different times, different heels and all that. But a big part of it was the ability of Lance Russell to connect to that audience and sell that audience on the fact that what they were seeing was real enough. You know, it wasn't, real enough to that the product had integrity and the characters had integrity, and, you know, they kept him out of angles except for maybe 2 or 3 times over that entire period, because it would have been so easy for a heel to knock down Lance and Jerry Lawler to go after the heel. And, you know, you could do that. You could do that anytime, and you would probably draw a sellout with it. But they knew enough that once you started doing that, it's a line you couldn't cross. And there, you know, he did an angle here and there. I don't remember all of them. I remember when Jimmy Hart poured flour over his head, which was actually an angle that, you know, Lawler and him, when Jimmy had given notice and he was going to WWF, he had signed with WWF. So they were looking for a way to get him out, and that's, you know, he poured flour over Lance's head, and Jimmy Hart was banned forever for pouring, you know, it wasn't nothing physical. It was just, you know, you don't touch Lance. And you couldn't touch Dave because Dave was a weatherman, and like that, you just couldn't do that, which was actually, again, you know, probably the greatest thing for them, because they resisted the urge, you know, because it was, you know, you couldn't have the weatherman, you know, do something physical or humiliate him or do anything to embarrass him on that show. So they were pretty much not allowed. And when Lance was the program director, you know, and everything, you couldn't do that either. So it was like, by not being allowed to do angles with the announcers, and Memphis did the goofiest angles there were, with everyone and anyone. I mean, that was one of the best things that ever happened to them, is that they couldn't do that, because if they did it and it worked, and it would have, they would have kept doing it, and then they would have been clowns just like the other clowns. And that was a big part of the success of that territory. So, but just a wonderful human being. I feel so bad for his kids, Lance Jr. and Shane and Valerie, of course, just passed away on Friday. Like literally Valerie passed away, like right after Lance had the fall, maybe simultaneous. I mean, it was just right, roughly the same moment, so to speak. And he was, they took him to hospice care, after, he suffered the broken hip. He had actually fallen the previous Monday, but he was okay, from that fall. I think he was walking the dog down the street and fell. And I met the kids at all three of the kids at Cauliflower Alley last year for the first time, and they were like the sons and daughter of Lance Russell, and they were so proud of their father being inducted to Cauliflower Alley, and Lawler coming in, and Lawler gave a wonderful speech. And this is, it's been a freaking terrible year. I mean, there's no other way of putting it.
This year has been horrible.
It really has. It's been such a horrible year. I mean, it's funny because I kind of joke that like there's aspects of this shouldn't be about me, but there's aspects of my life that I'm happier with than any period in my life. But the flip side is like, this has been a freaking horrible year for me, for you, for Bryan, for a lot of wrestling fans, with not just the names of guys, but just Jesus Christ, Scott Williams and Dave Corner, who was, Dave Corner this is another Lance story. When I was in college, this is actually no, okay, yeah, because it was I would have been in college, yeah. So I think I take this back. I think this was a few years after college. I was in college, and Dave Corner, who passed away right around WrestleMania time, who was one of the guys, really key guys in getting me to do the Observer in some ways, but he so with Lance, when we were in college, we would watch wrestling tapes all the time in college together. We had this room, and we knew the people who did the audio, the video room and everything like that. And so we'd get people in, we'd eat lunch together a couple of days a week, and we'd watch, wrestling from Japan and wrestling from Memphis and the Von Erichs and Madison Square Garden and, whatever the good stuff was, which a lot of it was the Memphis stuff in that era. Lawler and Dutch Mantell and Dundee and the different types of crazy Terry Funk, all those kind of crazy matches. So they all like thought Lance was the greatest announcer, because he was. And so Lance Russell found out about this. And Lance didn't, because this, again, you got to understand the time frame. Like Lance knew that like Memphis wrestling was really popular in Memphis, but he never really at that time knew that people were, watching on videotape all over the country. And there weren't a lot, but there was a group of us that were watching Memphis tapes. So he had found out, and somehow, he called me up and just was like, which was like, Lance Russell's calling me up, and he, was just really nice guy, and just was like, I just amazed that people like at colleges are watching our wrestling in California. It's just like he just couldn't fathom that people in California were watching Memphis, their little Memphis studio wrestling show. And so, that was well and good and everything like that. And so I had told, my friends, you won't believe Lance Russell called me up to talk about us watching the videotapes. And I mean, they believed me, but, it was kind of like, I don't know. I mean, I know, like, no one said, oh yeah, you're making this up. But 2 weeks later, I get the tape of the Memphis show for that week, and there's Lance on the show, and he just goes, to Dave Brown, he goes, I just found out that there's guys in college in California, and I shouldn't say college because we were a couple years out of college by then, but but there's people in colleges all over, and people all over the country, they watch our show on television. And I showed it to my friends, and they were like, oh my God, he's like talking about us on Memphis TV. They thought it was like the greatest thing in the world. And so, and he was really, really good with different lessons and things like that. And, just, you're not going to hear anyone say anything bad about Lance Russell. I mean, people did at certain points when there were promotional things and all that, because it's just, but in recent years, not at all. And, every time Lance was on one of our shows, the guy was just, everyone loved listening to Lance's stories and everything. And I would, when the light would go on, Lance was really old. And, the truth is that Lance sometimes would get confused and everything like that. And I was like trepidatious. I never wanted to put, there's certain people I didn't want to put on at the end. But Lance, it was funny because it was like, he would forget things and things like that. But when he would do our show, he would do our show and everything, and it was over. It's like, holy fuck. It's like, why was I worried about Lance? I should never worry about Lance. He's the greatest. And even if he forgot, he was so damn charming that it didn't matter anyway. And everyone knew, look, Lance is 89 years old. And, it was just like that whenever he did his public appearances in the recent years and everything like that, is people just love that guy. And I love that guy. And so I don't know, Bryan, you knew him and you talked to him too.
That's right. I didn't talk to him nearly as much as you did, but yeah, I didn't grow up with Memphis wrestling, but even not growing up with it, it was so cool that he was part of that hotline, going back to what we started at the beginning. And then, yeah, we had him on the shows all the time, and I can remember on the show there would be like maybe one question where he'd just be like, I don't know, I forget or whatever. But like the rest of the show, he was great.
He was so charming about it, though. It's just like, well, I just don't remember it.
That's right.
Yeah.
He was a great guy, and condolences to everybody, you especially, to his family,
to everyone who grew up in that area, who grew up watching him. And for those of you who did not have the privilege of seeing it, go up on YouTube and watch some of those old shows. He's the, as far as a regional wrestling announcer that hosted a show, there was nobody. Like I said, there's nobody better. There was nobody as good, and there never will be. And Gene was really great in the AWA and WWF and even WCW. Gene was really great at a certain role of wrestling in the sense of being the interview guy to play off the talent. And Gordon Soley was really good at technically calling a wrestling match, and Jim Ross was really good at bringing the excitement. Like Lance was not. Some people say, have said like Lance was the best play-by-play guy ever, and he really wasn't. He was very good at it. He was not the best play-by-play guy, but the whole complete package, as far as knowing the instinctual ability to do interviews with the heels and the baby faces. The two best guys were probably Lance and Walt Harris, who nobody knows. And I never actually saw, but I always heard about. And then, many, many, many years later, people started sending me audio tapes that they had of Walt Harris. And Walt Harris and I would listen to him and was like, wow, Walt Harris is like, he's equivalent to Lance Russell. But and he maybe he was, he was part of a big boom here before I was a fan. And had a great reputation. He's still alive too, by the way. He's in his mid-90s, but he's Walt Harris is far more known for roller derby than for wrestling. But he was a big wrestling announcer as well. But for the whole package, I will always say that like the best 1-2 announcing punch was Lance and Dave. They weren't, as far as for what the job they had to do and the business that territory did, like it speaks for itself, for the size of the cities and the numbers of people that they drew to wrestling shows on a weekly basis. it's unbelievable. I mean, like, you can go in like a New York or a Chicago or something like that drew really big crowds, but look at the population difference. And, television ratings wise, no wrestling show from a regional standpoint, no wrestling show in history ever pulled those kind of numbers. Even in places like Georgia where they did great numbers, the Carolinas where they did great numbers, they never pulled Memphis numbers. Mid-South Wrestling used to do great numbers on television, but it was never, nobody could do Memphis numbers. It was just a part of the fabric, same time slot, same, they did one television switch in 77, but from, whatever it was, the 60s through on. And Lance also grew up as a wrestling fan in Dayton, Ohio before he ever announced wrestling. And, he told me he first announced wrestling in 1950 on television, which may have been before Memphis. I'm not even sure. I think he may have done some stuff in Ohio first. Then he started doing it in, it might have been Jonesboro, Arkansas. But he did a local wrestling show before he actually started working for the Goulas promotion. But he was around in the 50s with Sputnik Monroe. I mean, he told me all the stories about, Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks in the late 50s. That's 57, which was a boom period in Memphis wrestling when Sputnik, crossed the racial barrier or whatever. It was like such a insane world we lived in back then. I mean, it just, the Sputnik story, and a lot of people know this one, is in those days, the Ellis Auditorium, and this was the case for everything in Memphis, not just wrestling. In fact, wrestling was more progressive than most. That, if you went to a sports event, you went to a concert, you went to a whatever, there was the colored section and there was the white section. And all of the colored people, and that's the term they used then, I don't use that term myself, they would have to sit in one section and the other people would sit in another section. And it was obviously the best seats. They could not sit in the best seats if they had the money for them or not. And what was happening and with wrestling, because of Sputnik Monroe, who was a big draw, was that a lot of black fans were going to the matches and they had to sit in a section, and they would sell out the black section and turn people away. But the white section had plenty of empty seats every week. And Sputnik, and it wasn't just Sputnik, the promoter, hated this. He's a wrestling promoter. He hates turning people away when there's empty seats. But he knew that if he complained or he said anything, that community in that country, in that part, the maybe the young kids or anything like that would think that it was progressive and wouldn't be so mad. But his age group, the guys in their 50s and 60s, and it had always been this way. I mean, that would be equivalent to treason to say that, that blacks should be allowed to sit in the empty seats in the white section. If it's even movie theaters were like that. And so he couldn't do anything. He wanted to. So Sputnik was like his out, and Sputnik was glad to do it anyway, because Sputnik was like a Dusty Rhodes in the sense that, he was the, he would hang out in the black sections with the black fans. That's why he was so popular with them. He was a babyface to them, even though he was a heel to everyone else. So Sputnik, who was a big draw, went in there and said that, I will not wrestle here until blacks can sit anywhere in this building. And so the promoter, and I think it was Roy Welch. In fact, it was Roy Welch. Roy would just go, well, he's my biggest star and my biggest draw, and I can't afford to lose him. And he took heat for it anyway. So he opened the seating up to, blacks to sit anywhere, and blacks and whites would sit together and cheer and boo together, and there were never incidences. And that led to, very quickly from that moment, theaters and sporting events and all, concerts and everything, that there were no longer the colored section where they could only sit. And I mean, it was said that in that generation in Memphis, Sputnik Monroe was like the hero to the black community, because he was the one who, started the ball rolling to where the horrible Jim Crow law stuff, started going away in that city, in that part of the country. So, and Lance was part of that too, I mean, in the sense of he was the announcer then, and sold it. And, I'm sure to some people when he was explaining it had to take the heat for that too. Although he never, I talked to him about that, and it was like he never felt like he took, there was any heat on him. And he said that it was actually very smooth. I mean, it's a real story, but, Sputnik was the one who was the one who got the real heat, because Sputnik was the one who, was very happy getting the heat, because the reality is if the people hated him, Sputnik was the lead heel. He wasn't the lead babyface. So if people hated him, he considered that, he considered that a positive too. So, but yeah, the guy was there for, probably doing Memphis wrestling from the late 50s through 96, other than the couple of years he spent with WCW. And then, comebacks many, many times, and always, whenever we'd come back from Gulf Breeze, and coming to town, it was the celebrity coming into town. There's a thing, you could look it up on YouTube. It was a couple of years ago when him and Dave, and it was real sad. And if you watch the very end of it, it was like Lance was in town and Dave did a 4-part series with Lance just talking about wrestling. And at the very end, it was almost like, wow, this is the last time they're going to be on TV together like this. And Lance says something, like Dave just, thank you for all the memories. And Lance says something at the end about, what a great friend you've been. And he loved Dave Brown. He would talk about, like it was his own son that, he started in the business and Dave became the big successful news personality. Lance picked him, and then he went on to be this, huge success in his business for almost 50 years. And, obviously Dave will, I'm sure there'll be stuff that Dave will say and everything like that over the next couple of days. And probably, I'm sure he'll be interviewed on different stations in that market and everything, or at least Channel 5, where he's got the affiliation. But, and Lawler will probably, I'm sure Lawler will be all over the media there as well. And, this was, for people who were fortunate enough to know the guy, they'll know what, hopefully you can kind of get what a just great guy this guy was, and how important he was to, my life as a fan. Just, that was one of my favorite things, was watching when those Memphis tapes came. It wasn't the best wrestling by any means, but what a fun television show that thing was. And, if you go on the YouTube, Bryan, you remember this show, the one where, because we've talked about this one before, the show where Lawler was suspended. He'd lost to Lose Leave Town, and they had to bring him back because the gates were so terrible that they had to bring him back. They were starting to lose money. He was supposed to be gone for 6 months. It was about 3 months in, and they had to shoot some angle that was completely believable to bring him back. And, so it was Bill Dundee and Buddy Landel just got so much heat on that show. And there's Lance, and Jarrett, and Jerry Jarrett was part of it. And Jeff Jarrett was a teenager who was a referee who Landel and Dundee beat up. And that was one of the greatest 90-minute wrestling television shows that was ever made.
I'm sure the Observer this week is going to have more on this. Is that the plan, or?
Well, there's no choice but that, yeah.
So we'll talk about that in the Observer this week. And Observer Live's coming up. If you've got any comments, if you have any memories of Lance Russell, you can call in or text in with those. We'll talk about those today. And I'm sure a lot more to come as well. We got stuff up on the front page, as Dave noted. Make sure you check out YouTube. There's all sorts of great Memphis stuff on YouTube with Lance. And that's it. We're going to wrap this up. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you again after a while.